They laughed when a rich man poured his pride over a widow's face. And by sunrise, not one of them could lift their eyes from the dirt. The saloon smelled of whiskey, sweat, and dust dragged in from boots that had walked too many miles and learned too little mercy. And in the center of it all stood Margaret Hale, her dress worn thin at the sleeves, her hands steady despite the way the room leaned against her like a storm about to break. Caleb Vance tilted his glass with a lazy smile, the kind that came from owning land, men, and silence. And when the amber liquid touched her cheek, slow and deliberate, the laughter came easy, like it had been waiting all night for a reason. Chairs creaked, someone muttered something cruel under their breath, and no one moved. Not a single soul between the bar and the door, as if kindness cost more than they could afford. Margaret did not wipe her face. Not right away. She just stood there, eyes clear, fixed somewhere beyond Caleb's shoulder as though she were measuring something none of them could see. Outside, the wind pressed against the wooden walls, carrying the dry scent of sage and distant rain that never quite arrived, and for a moment, it felt like the whole town was holding its breath without knowing why. Caleb chuckled, low and satisfied, setting his glass down like a man finishing a small chore, then turned his back on her before she could answer. Because men like him never waited for replies, Margaret finally lifted her hand, slow, deliberate, brushing the last of the whiskey from her skin, not with shame, but with something quieter, something heavier, and when she walked toward the door, her steps made almost no sound, yet every eye followed her, even the ones pretending not to. The door opened with a soft groan, letting in a strip of cold night air that cut through the heat of the room, and then she was gone, swallowed by darkness and dust. No one spoke after that, not for a while, the laughter fading into something thinner, something unsure, as if it had been borrowed and now needed returning. In the far corner, a man who hadn't touched his drink sat still, his fingers resting on the rim of a tin cup, his gaze fixed on the door long after it closed. And though no one noticed him leave, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor carried longer than it should have, like a warning no one understood yet, but all of them would remember before the sun came up. Margaret Hale walked the long road home with the taste of whiskey still lingering on her lips, not from the drink, but from what it meant, and the night air pressed cold against her skin as the lights of Red Hollow faded behind her one window at a time. Her house stood nearly a mile out past the last fence line, a small wooden place leaning into the wind like it had grown tired of standing alone, and every step she took felt measured, not rushed, not broken, just steady, as if she had already made peace with something no one else could see. Inside the saloon, the laughter had died quicker than it had started, replaced by the quiet shuffle of boots and the low murmur of men pretending nothing had happened, because forgetting was easier than remembering what they had allowed. Caleb Vance poured himself another drink, but did not finish it, his smile thinner now, stretched across his face like something that did not quite belong there anymore, and he glanced once toward the door before looking away too quickly, as if the darkness outside might be watching him back. Across the room, the empty chair in the corner had gone unnoticed, though the man who once sat there had stepped into the night without a word, his coat brushing dust from the floor, his pace unhurried but certain, like someone following a path that had been waiting for him. The wind picked up along the ridge, carrying with it the faint sound of distant hooves, too soft at first to matter, too far to name, but steady in a way that did not belong to chance. Margaret reached her porch and paused with her hand on the door, not to rest, not to hesitate, but to listen, her eyes lifting toward the horizon where the sky met the earth in a thin line of silver moonlight. And for a brief moment, something moved out there, not close enough to fear, but not far enough to ignore. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her with a quiet click, the sound small but final, and the house settled around her with the creak of old wood and memory. Back in town, a few men drifted out into the street, drawn by something they could not explain, their boots crunching against the dirt as they looked toward the same dark horizon Margaret had seen, and though none of them spoke, the same thought passed between them like a shadow. Something had changed, something had begun. Caleb remained by the bar, staring into his glass as if it held answers. But the reflection looking back at him did not carry the same certainty it had an hour ago, and somewhere beyond the edge of town, The sound of hooves grew clearer, not louder, just closer, measured and patient, like time itself riding in without hurry, knowing it would be seen when it chose to be. The night stretched longer than it should have, the kind that settled into bones and refused to leave, and out beyond the last fence of Red Hollow. A single lantern flickered inside Margaret Hale's home, its light steady despite the wind pressing against the walls like a quiet test. She moved through the small room with slow, deliberate motions, setting a kettle on the iron stove, folding a worn shawl across the back of a chair, her hands never trembling, her breath never uneven, as though what had happened in town had already been placed somewhere far behind her. But every so often, her eyes drifted to the window, to the thin slice of darkness where the land rolled outward into silence. And each time she looked, she listened, not for danger, but for something she seemed to expect. Miles away, along the ridge that overlooked the town, shapes moved against the horizon, not hurried, not hidden, just present, their horses stepping in rhythm with a patience that did not belong to ordinary travel. And at their center rode a man with his hat pulled low, his posture straight, his gaze fixed on the faint glow of Red Hollow below. Elias Crow did not speak as he rode, did not signal, did not turn, because the men behind him needed no direction. They followed the same quiet certainty that carried through the cold air like a promise. Back in town, the saloon had emptied halfway, though no one could say why they chose to leave early. Only that the walls felt tighter, the air heavier, and the memory of a woman walking out alone had begun to settle differently in their minds. One man stood near the doorway, staring into the dark street as if expecting someone to return, while another sat with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, the laughter from earlier now sounding distant even in his own memory. Caleb Vance remained where he was, though he had not taken another drink, his fingers resting against the glass as if it anchored him to something solid. And when the faint sound of hooves finally reached the edge of town, he heard it before anyone else did, not because it was loud, but because it carried a weight he could not ignore. He stepped outside just far enough to see the ridge, just far enough to notice the stillness forming there, and for a moment, he told himself it was nothing, just travelers passing through, just another night in a place that belonged to him. But the riders did not pass, and the silence they brought with them began to spread, slow and certain, from the edge of the world toward the center of his. Out at the small house beyond the fences, Margaret finally sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady on that same distant ridge, and as the first hint of dawn began to touch the sky with a pale, uncertain light, she did not look surprised. She did not look afraid. She only waited, as if she had known all along that the night would not end the way it began. The first light of dawn did not rise so much as it revealed what had already been there, a pale gray stretching across the sky as the ridge overlooking Red Hollow filled with still figures that had not moved for hours, their horses quiet, their presence heavy in a way that made the town feel smaller than it had ever been. The men who had stepped outside earlier now stood in the street, scattered but frozen, each of them staring toward the same horizon, their boots planted in dust that suddenly felt too loud to shift, too exposed to disturb. No one spoke, not even in whispers, because something about the silence demanded respect they did not understand. Caleb Vance stepped farther out onto the wooden walkway, the boards creaking beneath his weight as if reminding him that this ground, like everything else, could answer back when pushed too far, and his eyes narrowed against the growing light, trying to make sense of the shapes lined across the ridge, trying to place them into something familiar, something he could control. But there was no rush in those riders, no threat shouted, no weapon drawn, just the quiet certainty of men who had arrived exactly when they meant to. One of the townsfolk shifted beside the water trough, the faint scrape of leather against wood sounding sharper than it should have, and that small noise carried across the street like a question no one dared to ask aloud. Then, without warning, a single rider began to move, not quickly, not with purpose that could be called aggressive, just a slow descent down the slope toward the town, his horse stepping carefully over the uneven ground, each hoofbeat measured, echoing in the stillness like the ticking of something long delayed. The others did not follow, they remained on the ridge, watching, waiting, as if one man was enough. Margaret Hale stood inside her home, the door still closed behind her, But she had risen from the chair by the window, her hand resting lightly against the wood as she listened, her expression unchanged, calm in a way that did not come from ignorance, but from understanding. Back in town, Caleb's jaw tightened, his confidence thinning with each step the rider took, because this was not how fear usually arrived, not with silence, not with patience, and certainly not with the absence of chaos. The rider reached the edge of the main road and stopped, not 20 yards from the first building, his figure outlined by the growing light. And for a long moment, he did nothing at all, just sat there, looking at the town as if measuring it the same way Margaret had measured that room the night before. Then he removed his hat, slow enough for every eye to follow. And in that simple motion, something shifted in the air, something that made the men who had laughed feel suddenly seen, not by him alone, but by something larger, something they could not step away from. Caleb took one step forward, just one, but it felt heavier than anything he had done before, because for the first time, he did not know what came next, and the man on the road, still silent, still unmoving, seemed to know everything. The man on the road did not raise his voice, did not urge his horse forward. He simply sat there in the early light, holding the silence like it belonged to him, and the town of Red Hollow, for all its noise and pride, seemed to shrink around that quiet. Caleb Vance forced a breath through his chest and stepped off the wooden walkway, his boots hitting the dirt with a firmness that sounded less certain than he intended, and he walked a few paces forward as if distance alone could restore control. But the rider did not react, not even a shift in posture, not even a glance toward the men gathering behind Caleb. One by one, the townsfolk drifted closer, not out of courage, but because standing alone felt worse, their shoulders drawn tight, their eyes moving between Caleb and the stranger as though waiting to be told what this meant. The wind moved lightly through the street, lifting dust in thin ribbons that curled and faded before they could settle, and somewhere behind the buildings, a loose shutter tapped softly, the only sound that dared interrupt the moment. The rider finally moved, not toward them, but with a slow motion of his hand reaching inside his coat, and for a fraction of a second, several men stiffened, their breath catching, their minds racing toward conclusions they had learned too quickly in a place like this. But what emerged was not a weapon, not even something threatening, just a small object that caught the light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. He held it out at arm's length, not presenting it, not demanding attention, simply allowing it to be seen, and the glint of silver carried across the distance with a weight that no words could match. Caleb's eyes fixed on it, his expression tightening as recognition crept in slow and unwelcome, because some things did not need explanation, some symbol spoke louder than any voice, and this one spoke of authority that did not bend to wealth or reputation. Behind the rider, the figures on the ridge remained unmoving, their presence unchanged, like a boundary drawn in silence. And for the first time since stepping outside, Caleb glanced back over his shoulder, just once, as if measuring the distance between himself and the men who had stood with him only hours ago. But their faces offered nothing, no laughter, no support, only a growing unease that spread from one to another, like a quiet truth, out beyond the last fence. Margaret Hale opened her door and stepped onto her porch, the morning light touching her face with a softness that did not erase the memory of the night, and she looked toward the town, toward the road, her gaze steady and unafraid, as if she were watching a story unfold that she already understood. Back in the street, the rider lowered his hand slightly, the silver still visible, still undeniable, and though he had not spoken a single word, the question now hung in the air for all of them, not what he wanted, but what they had done, and whether any of them were ready to answer it. The silver in the rider's hand did not shine brighter as the sun climbed, but it seemed to grow heavier in the eyes of every man standing in the street, and the silence that followed stretched so thin it felt like it might tear. Caleb Vance swallowed once, slow and dry, his gaze fixed on that small badge as if looking away might make it disappear, but it did not, and neither did the man holding it. Elias Crow lowered his hand just enough to rest it near his side, not hiding the badge, not displaying it, simply letting it exist, and that was enough. A murmur almost formed among the townsfolk, but it died before it could become sound, because none of them wanted to be the first to speak. Not now. not with something this quiet pressing against their chests. Caleb took another step forward, then stopped. The distance between him and Elias no more than 20 feet, but it felt like a line drawn across years, across choices, across things left unsaid. You are a long way from where that badge matters, Caleb said finally, his voice steady at first, then thinner at the edges, like a rope pulled too tight. Elias did not answer right away. He only looked at him, calm, measuring, the kind of look that did not rush to fill silence, because it already understood it. When he spoke, his voice was low, even, carrying just enough to reach every ear without effort. It matters wherever truth has been left behind, and the words settled into the dust like something permanent. A man near the trough shifted his weight again, then stilled, his eyes dropping to the ground, and another followed, then another, small movements, barely noticeable, but together they changed the shape of the crowd. Caleb let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but it did not carry any warmth. Truth, he repeated, as if testing the word, as if it were something he had not used in a long time, and he glanced once more at the men behind him, searching for agreement, for support, but found only uncertainty reflected back. Elias reached into his coat again, slower this time, and brought out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, handled more than once, and he did not wave it, did not thrust it forward. He simply held it between his fingers as though it carried its own weight. Some things do not stay buried, he said, and though his tone did not rise, the meaning did. Caleb's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as if trying to see through the paper, to read it without touching it. But something in his posture shifted, a fraction, a crack that no one could name but all of them could feel. Out at the edge of town, the riders on the ridge remained still, their presence unchanged, patient as ever, and the morning light continued to spread, revealing more of what had been hidden in shadow, more of what could no longer be ignored. On her porch, Margaret Hale stood with her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze steady on the town, not searching, not questioning, just watching. And in that quiet, something passed between distance and understanding, something that did not need words. Back in the street, Elias lowered the paper again, not offering it yet, not forcing it into the moment, because he did not need to. The silence was already doing the work, and for the first time since the night before, the weight in the air did not belong to laughter or fear, but to something else entirely. Something that asked nothing more than for each man to remember exactly where he had been standing when it all began. The paper in Elias Crow's hand did not move, yet it drew every eye as if it carried a gravity of its own, and the longer he held it without offering, the more it seemed to say. Caleb Vance shifted his stance, boots pressing deeper into the dust, his gaze fixed on that folded sheet like it was a mirror he refused to look into, and the town around him waited, not for action, but for permission to understand what they were already beginning to feel. The wind eased, just enough to let the quiet settle fully, and in that stillness, even the smallest sounds took on weight. The creak of a sign, the faint rustle of fabric, the steady breathing of men who had not yet decided where to stand. Elias spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. There was a man who kept records, he said, his eyes never leaving Caleb. Careful records, written by hand, sealed, witnessed, and then forgotten by everyone except the one who needed them most. And the words moved through the crowd like a slow ripple, touching one face, then another. A man near the saloon door lifted his head, recognition flickering across his features before he looked away again, and another rubbed the back of his neck, as if something old had just been pulled forward into the light. Caleb exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. Stories, he said, though the word lacked conviction. Out here, stories do not hold weight. But even as he spoke, his eyes drifted once more to the paper, and that brief glance was enough. Elias tilted the paper slightly, letting the edge catch the morning light, revealing a faint mark pressed into the fold, a seal, worn but intact, and though no one could read it from where they stood, they did not need to, because symbols carried their own language in places like this. Not stories, Elias replied. Records, and he paused, just long enough for the word to settle. Signed by the man who owned less than you, but stood straighter than most. And that was when the first real shift happened. subtle but undeniable, a step backward from one of Caleb's men, then another, small distances that spoke louder than any protest. Out on the porch, Margaret Hale watched without moving, her face calm, her eyes steady, as if she were seeing something long promised finally take shape. And the light of morning framed her in a way that made her seem both present and distant at once, like a memory stepping into the present. Back in the street, Caleb lifted his chin slightly, trying to reclaim the space he had filled so easily the night before. But the air no longer answered to him. It had changed, turned, and now held something he could not command. "If you have something to say it," he said, his voice sharper now, pushing against the quiet, trying to break it. But the words fell short, because the silence did not belong to him anymore. Elias looked at him for a long moment, then finally unfolded the paper, slow, deliberate, the sound of it opening carrying across the street like a door no one could close again. And though he had not yet spoken what was written there, the town of Red Hollow felt it already, the weight of something true rising to the surface, asking only one thing in return, that they do not look away this time. The paper opened fully in Elias Crow's hands, its creases soft from years of being folded and unfolded, carried and kept. And though the ink upon it was too faint to read from where the townsfolk stood, the weight of it settled over Red Hollow like a shadow that no light could push away. Elias did not rush to speak. He let the silence stretch. Let every man standing there feel the space between what they remembered and what they had chosen to forget. And when he finally lifted his eyes from the page, they moved not just to Caleb Vance, but across the crowd, one face at a time, as if each of them had been written into the same story whether they admitted it or not. "This was signed 12 years ago," he said, his voice even, carrying without force, "by a man named Thomas Hale," and the name moved through the air like something familiar, yet distant, a memory buried under dust and convenience. A few men shifted where they stood, one lowering his head, another glancing toward Margaret's distant house as though the name had drawn a line straight from past to present. Caleb's expression hardened, but there was a flicker beneath it, something quick and guarded, like a thought he did not want to follow. "A deed," Elias continued, lifting the paper slightly, "recorded, witnessed, and sealed before this town ever decided to look the other way." And the words did not accuse, they did not rise, but they settled deeper than any shout could have. The wind returned then, soft but steady, brushing through the street and carrying the faint scent of dry grass, as if the land itself had been waiting to hear what was finally being said. Caleb let out a breath that almost formed a smile, but it did not reach his eyes. "Old paper does not change what is," he said, though his voice lacked the ease it once carried. "Land changes hands. People move on." But even as he spoke, his gaze lingered too long on that document, as if it held more than he could dismiss. Elias did not argue, did not step closer. He simply lowered the paper again and said, "Land remembers." And in that moment, something shifted in the crowd, not loudly, not all at once, but in small ways that added up. A man removing his hat, another stepping back, another no longer standing at Caleb's shoulder. Out beyond the last fence, Margaret Hale remained still on her porch, her figure quiet against the morning light. And though she could not hear every word, she did not need to, because the truth had a way of carrying farther than sound. Back in the street, Caleb's shoulders straightened, but the space around him felt wider now, emptier, and for the first time, he stood without the certainty that had once followed him like a shadow. Elias folded the paper once more, not to hide it, but to hold it, and the gesture felt final in a way that no verdict had yet been spoken. And still, the town understood, not through orders, not through force, but through something quieter, something that could not be undone, the simple act of seeing what had always been there. And realizing that this time, no one was willing to pretend otherwise. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the bones of every man standing in that street. And the longer it held, the harder it became to stand where they once had so easily. Caleb Vance remained in place, but something in his posture had shifted, not enough for a stranger to see, but enough for those who had stood beside him for years to notice, the slight tightening of his shoulders, the way his hands no longer rested as comfortably at his sides. He looked from Elias Crow to the ridge beyond, then back again, as if measuring distance against certainty, and for the first time, the two did not align. One of the men who had laughed the night before took a slow step backward, the movement small, almost accidental, but it drew attention, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Another followed, then another, not fleeing, not even leaving, just creating space. As though standing too close now carried a weight they were no longer willing to bear. Elias did not move to fill that space. He did not press forward or demand anything. He simply remained where he was, the folded paper resting in his hand, the silver badge catching just enough light to remind them all what it stood for. 12 years is a long time to forget, he said quietly, not to accuse, but to name something that had already begun to surface. But it is not long enough for truth to disappear. The words drifted through the crowd, and this time, they did not pass through. They stayed, settling in the spaces where laughter had once been. Caleb drew a breath, deeper now, slower, as if steadying himself against something unseen. "You think a piece of paper changes anything out here?" he said, but there was no challenge in his tone, only a question that had lost its footing before it was even spoken. Elias met his gaze, steady, unblinking. "No," he said. "People do." The answer did not echo. It did not need to, because the shift had already begun, visible in the way men lowered their eyes, in the way no one stepped forward to stand beside Caleb now, in the way the town itself seemed to lean away from him without a word being spoken. Out beyond the last fence, Margaret Hale stepped down from her porch, her boots touching the dirt with quiet certainty, and she began to walk toward town, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. Each step measured as though she had walked this path many times before, even if she had not. The distance between her and the street was long, but it did not feel distant, not anymore, because every eye that had once avoided her now turned in that direction, drawn not by fear, but by something closer to recognition. Back in the street, Caleb followed their gaze, and when he saw her walking toward them, alone, unchanged, something in his expression faltered, not dramatically, not enough to break, but enough to reveal the first crack in something that had once seemed unshakable. Elias lowered his hand slightly, not in surrender, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement of what was coming, and for the first time since dawn, the silence shifted again, no longer waiting, no longer holding back, but opening, making room for something that had been kept out too long. And as Margaret drew closer, the town of Red Hollow understood without needing to be told. This was no longer about what had been done, but about what would be faced. Margaret Hale did not slow as she crossed the last stretch of open land, her steps even, her posture unchanged, and with each yard she closed, the town seemed to pull back from itself, creating a path that had not existed before. The men who had gathered now stood on either side of the road, not by command, not by force, but by something quieter, something that told them they no longer belonged in the center of this moment. Her dress moved lightly in the morning breeze, the same dress they had seen the night before, the same one they had laughed at, and yet now, not a single eye lingered on it, not a single voice rose to fill the space she carried with her. Caleb Vance remained where he stood, but the ground beneath him felt different, less certain, and as Margaret drew closer, he found himself watching her in a way he had not before, not as something beneath him, not as something to dismiss, but as something he could no longer define. "Elias." Crow stepped slightly to the side, not out of the way, but in quiet acknowledgement, his presence still firm, still grounded, yet no longer the center of attention, because the moment had shifted again, and it belonged now to the woman who had walked away in silence the night before. Margaret reached the edge of the gathered men and did not stop, her gaze forward, her expression calm, and as she passed the first of them, he lowered his head without thinking, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something closer to understanding. One by one, others followed, hats removed, eyes cast down, small gestures that carried more weight than any words they could have spoken. Caleb watched it happen, watched the space around him grow wider as the town that once stood behind him now stepped aside, and for the first time, he stood alone in a way he had never experienced, not because others had left, but because they no longer stood with him. Margaret stopped a few feet in front of him, not close enough to confront, not far enough to ignore, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them filled not with tension, but with something that demanded recognition. Caleb opened his mouth as if to say something, to reclaim the control he had lost, but no words came, because whatever he might have said belonged to the night before, and the morning had already moved past it. Margaret looked at him then, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a steady clarity that left no room for either. And in that look, everything that had been hidden, ignored, or dismissed found its place without needing to be named. Elias remained still, the paper in his hand, the badge at his side, but he did not intervene, he did not speak, because the truth no longer needed him to carry it forward. It had arrived on its own, walking across the dust of Red Hollow, and now stood where it had always belonged. The wind moved once more through the street, softer now, as if the land itself had exhaled, and in that quiet, Caleb lowered his gaze, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in the first honest moment he had allowed himself, and around him, the town followed, not because they were told to, but because they finally understood that looking away was no longer something they could afford. No one spoke when Margaret Hale lifted her eyes again, because the silence had already said more than words could carry, and in that stillness, something unseen began to settle into place. Caleb Vance stood across from her, his shoulders no longer squared against the world, but held in a way that suggested he was finally feeling its weight, and for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, he seemed to search for something to hold on to, some piece of certainty that had not already slipped through his hands. But there was nothing left to reach for, not in the faces around him, not in the ground beneath him, and not in the quiet presence of the man who had brought the truth to his doorstep. Elias Crow stepped forward then, not quickly, not with force, just enough to stand beside Margaret rather than between them, and he unfolded the paper once more, this time not for the town, not for Caleb, but for her. She did not take it right away, her gaze lingering on it as though she recognized its weight before ever touching it, and when her fingers finally closed around the worn edge, the motion was steady, deliberate, like something being returned rather than given. The breeze caught the corner of the document, lifting it slightly, revealing lines of ink that had endured time, silence, and neglect, and though no one leaned in to read, every person there understood what it meant without needing to see a single word. Margaret lowered the paper gently, holding it close, not as proof, not as a weapon, but as something that had always belonged to her, something that had never truly been lost, only set aside by those who found it easier not to remember. Caleb watched the exchange without interruption, his eyes fixed on the space between them, and for the first time, there was no attempt to reclaim the moment, no effort to speak over it, because whatever power he had once carried had already faded into something quieter, something less certain, behind him. The town had shifted fully now, not in movement, but in presence, no longer aligned by habit or fear, but by a shared awareness that could not be undone. A man removed his hat and held it at his side. Another turned slightly away, unable to meet Margaret's gaze. And even those who had said nothing the night before now felt the weight of that silence as though it had been spoken aloud. Elias stepped back again, giving space not out of necessity, but out of understanding, because this was no longer his place to stand. The truth had reached where it needed to go, and it no longer required a voice to carry it. Margaret looked once more at Caleb, not for judgment, not for victory, but for acknowledgement, and though he did not speak, though no apology formed on his lips, the way he lowered his head, the way his eyes finally dropped from hers, said more than any words could have. The wind moved through Red Hollow again, softer now, carrying away the last traces of what had been left unspoken. And as the morning light settled fully over the town, it revealed something new, not in the land, not in the buildings, but in the people who stood there, no longer able to pretend they had not seen what had always been in front of them, and no longer willing to turn away. The moment did not end with a word. It settled, like dust after a long ride, slow and final, and the people of Red Hollow stood in it without knowing where to place their hands or their eyes. Margaret Hale held the paper close, not tight, not guarded, just present, as if it had always belonged there, and in a way, it had, waiting through years of silence for a morning like this. Caleb Vance remained still, his head lowered, not out of command, not from fear, but from something unfamiliar that had finally found him. And though no one spoke his name, the space around him carried it differently now, no longer with weight, but with distance. One of the men who had laughed the night before cleared his throat softly, the sound barely there, yet it echoed through the quiet as though it carried apology, not spoken, not formed, but felt. Another shifted his hat from one hand to the other, then held it against his chest without realizing why. And these small gestures, scattered and uncoordinated, began to shape something larger, something that did not need agreement to exist. Elias Crow stepped back another pace, his role complete not because he declared it so, but because the truth no longer needed his presence to stand. It had taken root in the eyes of those who had once turned away. The riders on the ridge remained where they were, unchanged, silent witnesses to something that had resolved itself without force, and one by one, they began to turn their horses, not in retreat, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement that their purpose had been fulfilled. Margaret lifted her gaze from the paper and looked across the town, not searching for approval, not measuring their reaction, but simply seeing them as they were. And in that look, there was no accusation, no demand, only a calm that made the absence of judgment feel heavier than any blame. Caleb finally drew a breath that seemed to come from deeper than before, and though he did not raise his head, though he did not speak, the way he stood there, still and unguarded, marked a change that could not be reversed, because it had not been forced upon him. It had been revealed within him. The wind moved again, carrying the scent of dry earth and early morning, and it passed through the street without resistance, as if the town itself had shifted enough to let it through. A man stepped forward slightly, then stopped, unsure of what he intended to do, and after a moment, he simply nodded once, not to Elias, not to Caleb, but to Margaret, a gesture small and quiet, yet it carried more than any speech could have. Others did not follow, not yet, but they watched, and in their watching, something had already begun. Margaret turned then, not away from them, but toward the road that led back to her home, and she began to walk, the paper held steady in her hand, her steps the same as they had been before, calm, measured, unchanged, and behind her, the town did not return to what it had been. It did not resume its noise or its certainty. It remained still, as if understanding that some moments were not meant to pass, but to remain, shaping everything that came after. Margaret Hale did not look back as she walked away from Red Hollow, and that was what stayed with them long after she disappeared beyond the last fence. Not anger, not triumph, but the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed anything from the people who had once taken everything from her. The road stretched ahead of her, pale under the morning sun, and the paper in her hand did not feel heavy. It felt settled, like something that had finally found its rightful place after years of being carried by the wrong hands. Behind her, the town remained still, not frozen by fear, but held in a silence that asked for reflection, the kind that does not pass with time but lingers in the spaces between words and actions. Caleb Vance stood where she had left him, his shadow shorter now in the rising light, and though no one approached him, no one challenged him. The absence of both felt louder than anything he had known before, because for the first time, there was nothing to defend, nothing to command, only the echo of what he had done, and the realization that it had been seen, fully and clearly. One of the men who had stood closest to him the night before turned and walked away without a word, then another, and another, not in defiance, not in rebellion, but in quiet acknowledgement that standing there no longer meant what it once had. Elias Crow watched them for a moment, then placed the folded paper back into Margaret's hands before she had left, and now, with his task complete, he turned his horse slowly toward the open land, his movements unhurried, as though he had never been there to begin with, as though he had simply followed something that needed to be brought into the light, and now returned to wherever such things waited. The riders on the ridge were gone, their presence leaving no mark except the memory of their stillness, and even that seemed to fade as the day grew brighter. In the town, small changes began to take shape, not announced, not declared, but visible in the way doors opened more slowly, in the way voices lowered before rising, in the way eyes met and then held. just a moment longer than before. A man placed a loaf of bread on the edge of a porch where Margaret had once stood selling what little she had. Another repaired a fence that had been left broken for too long, and though no one spoke her name aloud, it moved quietly through their actions, shaping them in ways they did not fully understand. Caleb remained until the street had emptied, until the last of the watching eyes had turned away, and when he finally lifted his head, there was no one left to see it, no one left to measure the change that had begun. But it did not matter, because for the first time, it was not meant to be seen by others, it was meant to be carried by him. Far beyond the town, Margaret reached her home and paused at the door, the same way she had the night before. But this time, when she stepped inside, she did not listen for anything in the distance. She did not look back toward the horizon, because there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left waiting to arrive. The wind moved softly through the open land, carrying no weight, no warning, just the quiet rhythm of a world that had righted itself without a single shot, without a single raised voice. And somewhere in that stillness, something simple and undeniable remained. Out here, justice does not need to speak, it only needs to be seen.